I was asked by the Scottish Family Party to talk about single parenthood. What I'd like to do is explore single parenthood in the context of gendered patterns of employment and unemployment and show how these influence family formation. By doing so, I think we can get to some of the root causes of single parenthood. For clarification, I'm not saying economic factors are the most important. I think religious beliefs and family traditions are probably more important, as well as the laws surrounding marriage and divorce. But in terms of exercising political influence, I think that the way in which employment, tax and benefits structure the family is the way to go. Who are we looking at when we talk about single parents? In 2017, there were 1.8 million single-parent headed households in the UK, with dependent children representing 22% of families with dependent children. This proportion has been relatively static over the past 20 years. However, research suggests that about a third of families have at some point been single-parent families. And this is because there are many children growing up with cohabiting parents where one of the parents, usually the father, is a step-parent. These cohabiting relationships obscure the level of family instability because a child is counted for statistical purposes as growing up in a two-parent family. However, these two parents are not necessarily both the child's biological parents. In fact, these cohabiting relationships can involve much higher degrees of family instability than the lone mother who simply remains a lone mother while her child is at home. So the key statistic is not just the number of single-parent families, but the number of unstable families, which is often very difficult to pin down. I did find this one table which shows the number of children who grow up living with both parents by the age of the child. Although this table is from 2010, it is unlikely that the numbers will have gone down. And what you see if you look at this table is that by the age of 16, only half of children are living with both their biological parents. In 90% of cases, that biological parent will be the mother. So while we started out with a statistic of 22% of children growing up in single-parent families, we have ended up with a statistic of nearly 50% of children growing up without their father. And it is this growing up without a father which is the key statistic on which so much disadvantage hangs. The impact of fatherlessness is more dramatic than any other single variable. Fatherlessness is the most deterministic variable, it shapes them all. Let me remind you of some of the negative consequences of growing up in a fatherless household. So children from a fatherless household are twice as likely not to graduate from high school, more likely to be prone to emotional and mental health problems, they're at greater risk of suffering from physical or sexual abuse. They're more likely to engage in underage sex and become teenage parents. They're more likely to be excluded from school or to have committed a crime in the past year. They're more likely than those raised in an intact married family to form unstable relationships in later life themselves. There's a greater likelihood of being in custody, of receiving a prison sentence, increased externalizing behaviour, risky behaviour, suicide rates, and on and on it goes. Now, a key point is that it is rates of cohabitation and not marriage which determine this increase in fatherless families. So, for example, it is the 21% of cohabiting parents who account for 51% of all family breakdown involving children. In study after study, we find that parents who are married when their child is born are more likely to stay together than unmarried parents, even after taking relationship happiness, age, education and ethnicity into account. And the really bad news is that these problems are going to be increasing because the rates of cohabitation are going up. Since 1996, the proportion of cohabiting couple families has more than doubled, from 1.5 million families to 3.3 million families. On the other hand, the number of people married or civil partnered is in massive decline. Here we can see the marriage rates per 1,000 adults per year. And here we can see the proportion of women and the proportion of men who have ever married by age. The result is an actually tragic situation while 76% of 20 to 24-year-olds say they want to get married. In fact, only 55% actually ever will, and they'll probably have to wait a bit for that to happen. And it is not just the individual costs of this huge decline in marriage, it has significant society-wide costs as well. Higher levels of marriage are strongly associated with economic growth, more economic stability, less child poverty, and a higher median family income. Now, the other key point is that the extent to which marriage is a social justice issue. Among the least well-off in society, it is an increasingly rare social good. Here you can see how, by the age of 16, children in low-income families are very much more likely to not be living with both parents than children from high-income families. Among mothers with children under 5, 87% of those in higher income groups are married, compared to just 24% in lower income groups. Latest figures from the ONS show that 76% of new mothers in the top 2 social groups are married, compared to just 28% in the bottom 2 groups. So marriage, or rather the absence of it, is actually the linchpin through which social inequality is reproduced. Poorer families are much less likely to get married, and because they don't get married, they are much more likely to accumulate all the disadvantages which result from an unstable family life. So, if we want to understand lone parenthood and do something about it, we need to understand why less well-off people do not get married, and that is what I'm going to focus on now. Now, a large part of the significant decline in marriage is deeply cultural and related to the sexual revolution, contraception, abortion, the decline in religion, and so forth. And while some of this decline might be amenable to change through education, it's beyond the scope of what I'm looking at here. The first really significant declines in marriage coincided with female employment, and a great deal of ink was spilt exploring why this should be so. Theories looked at changes in the benefits of exchange between husband and wife, or women no longer being dependent on a patriarchal relationship and striking out for independence, and so forth. But actually, there was and is no systematic, consistent relationship between female employment and rates of marriage. And some researchers realised that they were looking in the wrong place. What in fact was actually happening was that the increase in female employment coincided with a decline in male employment. This was a period which saw severe declines in manufacturing, a weakening of the unions, and a decline in levels of male education. In what I call the Jane Austen effect, it was the hit to male employment rather than the increase in female employment which was causing the decline in marriage. So while female income and education have an important influence on marriage, that influence is inconsistent. But if we look at the influence of the man's level of education, his employment and wages in various combinations, the influence goes all one way. Male employment increases the chance of marriage. I will run through some findings. Firstly, we find that career stability increases male marriageability. Oppenheimer conducted longitudinal research on this topic and found that while earnings affected male marriageability, the effect of career stability was even stronger. Other research revealed the mechanisms of this. On one hand, men who had employment issues doubted their competence as providers and their attractiveness as potential partners, and therefore expressed a fear of enduring commitment. Women also had anxieties about what they saw as commitment to unreliable men. Xai et al. looked at the role of economic potential of both men and women and again found that women's earnings did not affect the likelihood of marriage. However, men's earnings potential clearly accelerated the marriage progress. Smock and Manning explored how a cohabiting couple's relative economic contribution affected the couple's transition to marriage. Their findings were very strong. The higher the man's annual earnings, the greater the likelihood of marrying rather than continuing to cohabit. Having a college degree increases the odds of marrying by 150%. Full-time male employment significantly reduced the odds of separation. The odds of marriage or separation could be predicted from the man's economic characteristics alone. Research shows it is labour market conditions which explain the positive relationship between educational attainment and marriage. If less educated men had equally good labour market conditions, the difference in marriage rates between the educated and less educated would reduce. Better labour markets are positively related to marriage for fathers at all educational levels. Orta looked at marriage rates among non-college educated adults in the US. He broke down the data according to class and race, as this shapes the patterns along which assortive mating occurs. He found that patterns of marriage almost directly follow changes in male wages for each ethnic group. Career Academies was a career-oriented high school program that provides a range of internship opportunities and training for disadvantaged high school students. An evaluation of the efficacy of the program found a causal link between male earnings and marriage rates. 8 years after students graduated from the program, those from the academy were earning on average $361 more per month and had higher levels of employment than those males assigned to the traditional high school program. However, perhaps even more remarkable was the impact on family formation. Male participants were 33% more likely to be married and living with their spouse, 30% more likely to be living with their partner and children, and 35% more likely to be the custodial parent of their child. Another striking finding is that it is not just the male wage which is important, but the relationship between the husband's and the wife's income. Women appear to sense that if they earn more than their husbands, this could threaten their relationship in some way. In fact, when there was a probability that the wife's potential income would exceed her husband's actual income, wives would distort their labour market participation to avoid a gender reversal in earnings. Where wives do out-earn their husbands, they appear to increase the amount of housework they do as if to compensate in some way. They also found that among 26% of couples, the 26% of couples where the wife earns more than the husband, they were more likely to report being less happy in their relationship and experienced higher levels of strife and a greater likelihood of divorce. Research from Denmark showed that at the point at which a wife's wages exceed the husband's, he was more likely to suffer from erectile dysfunction. Orta et al. Conducted an extensive and methodologically rigorous study which looked at how declines in US manufacturing industry impacted on male and female wages and how this in turn impacted on fertility and marriage. A particularly startling finding was the way in which lower wages impacted differently on men and women. In situations where only the woman's wage decreased, this actually had the effect of lowering the fraction of teen births and produced an even greater decline in the proportion of out-of-wedlock births. This suggests that this was because the relative value of men's wages increased for women. They argued that this could account for 30 to 40% of the observed change in the prevalence of marriage. It should be pointed out that marriage is beneficial for male productivity. Bradford Wilcox shows how family formation has strongly beneficial outcomes on male productivity. Men increase their earnings firstly when they're in a relationship, then when they get married, and then when children come along. The effect is known as the marriage premium, and it is particularly intense in the younger years, although it evens off. And just as we have seen links between male employment and marriage, so we find extensive evidence to suggest that female employment can have a negative impact on marriage. Now, all of this is particularly relevant to the UK, where we have, over the past 20 years, seen a serious worsening of men's economic position. The Institute of Fiscal Studies show how there has been an extremely poor growth in male earnings over an extended period. For the past 20 years, the growth in the earnings of working fathers has been 0.3% a year, while the mother's earnings have grown at 2% a year. The Resolution Foundation found that between 1997 and 2016, the share of male employees earning at or around the typical male weekly wage fell by approximately 15%. The share of men earning only a third of the median increased by 70%. The average hours worked by men lower in the employment hierarchy has fallen by 11.4%, with a 14 percentage point increase in the proportion working part-time. Most of these men are lower down the income distribution. By contrast, the hours worked by employed mothers has gone up, and also male part-time wages are lower than female part-time wages. These changes appear to be caused by the transfer of manufacturing to the Far East and stiff foreign competition in manufacturing and trade from companies which pay their workers a lot less. Industrial restructuring and the growing importance of technology have primarily increased the demand for skilled, educated workers at the expense of the economic well-being of the moderately to less well-educated. A decline in labour unions has led to a fall in men's wages. There has also been an increase in service sector jobs with the growth of the financial sector and welfare state. These sorts of jobs tend to attract women. Increasing employment flexibility, which may have encouraged a decline in employment rights. And another contributing factor is likely to be the decline in male performance in education, which does not appear to be viewed as a problem by the Department for Education. And then if you add into this the extreme way in which the male wage has been almost totally devalued by a system of tax credits and benefits, which seems designed to make it advantageous for a woman to kick even a working man out of her home, you will see that we have an extreme problem on our hands. So what are the policy implications? If male income facilitates marriage and increases marital stability, paying attention to male income would have a cascade of beneficial effects. This was something which Jennifer Barber concluded from her research on the fragile family study in the US. She suggested that the most effective public policy interventions should target circumstances before pregnancy occurs. She said, improving male employment prospects and rethinking mass incarceration policies might also enhance women's prospect of finding better mates and foster more cooperative parenting behaviour. In the light of this, it is the case that male employment is worthy of policy attention and economic investment. Some policy suggestions include: firstly, looking at the long-term implications of male educational outcomes. This would include not just trying to achieve equality in terms of male and female educational outcomes, but also paying more attention to the technical training and apprenticeship opportunities available for boys. It would also mean investing in industry and large-scale infrastructural projects, preferably in those areas of particularly high levels of male unemployment or poor male wages. Projects which would have environmental benefits and generate economic returns. A number of concerned organisations have also proposed changes to the marriage allowance, which would increase the value of the male wage. It also means looking at employment rights and moving towards more stable forms of employment. Some people might object to these sorts of measures because they distract attention from the alleged gender wage gap. However, the policies outlined here focus attention on the least well-off in society, where the gender wage gap is significantly smaller and even goes into reverse. It is only in the professional classes where the wage gap is larger. And there are a number of other reasons to suppose that the least well-off in society do not share the same concerns about the gender wage gap as their better-off sisters. As we have seen, women in these lower income groups very often do not have the benefits of a husband or even a male partner to support them. These women would probably be glad to see their sons and their brothers and even the potential fathers of their children earning a bit more money. Evidence suggests that better off women take much longer out of the employment market than their less well-off sisters when they have children, despite the fact that they lose out so much more money when they do take off that time. This is likely to be partly because these well-off women have husbands who can support them whilst they take their maternity leave. Their poorer sisters might also choose to take more time off for their maternity leave if they had husbands who were able to provide a sufficient income to support them as well. It is also the case that these less well-off women may have less interesting jobs and therefore prioritise their children more. Recent research conducted by the Institute of Fiscal Studies has shown that women who don't do further education are more likely to work fewer hours. It may well be that women with lower incomes are simply less motivated by employment. Raising the levels of marriage will result in more two-parent households, which will also increase the numbers of fathers involved with their children, thus also increasing opportunities for mothers to work. Some conclusions. So, the persistent focus we have had over the past few decades on the alleged gender wage gap placed a great deal of research and policy focus on individual earnings. However, most people live in family groups where their quality of life will be determined by the income of the whole household and the number of people living in it. By drawing attention to the male wage and the role which this has in family formation, I hope the findings and policy suggestions discussed here will have the effect of helping to reorientate policy back onto the family rather than the individual. In fact, once we start looking at female wages in the wider context of the whole family, we find new explanations for the gender wage gap starting to emerge. The traditional understanding of the wage gap is that women work less than men because men earn more money than they do. Therefore, women are compelled by this wage gap to take time off to look after their children. However, this is not what the evidence suggests. For example, evidence suggests married mothers call on the earnings of their partners to reduce their own work hours, than mothers in other household situations. There is also evidence which suggests that mothers with high wages use their extra earnings to buy themselves more time with their children. Finally, there is evidence of men who would like to spend more time with their children, but they're unable to do so because of the gatekeeping role which mothers of children play. All this suggests that the wage gap is not a consequence of women being compelled to take primary responsibility for childcare. Rather, because these women are married to better off men, they are able to spend more time with their children than they would be able to if they were less well off or single parents. If this is the case, the wage gap is actually an expression of the choices which better off women have. Because they have well-paid husbands, this enables them to spend more time with their children than they would be able to if they were less well off. The policies suggested here, by focusing on the male wage, would give less well-off women some advantages which are currently only available to their better-off sisters. Finally, family instability has been estimated to cost the Treasury £55 billion a year. If poor male earnings are feeding into family instability in the way suggested here, the Treasury would have considerable incentive to focus on male employment. The focus on female employment may well have had unintended consequences to social instability, and the costs to the Treasury will have far exceeded the benefits involved. Thank you. I look forward to talking about this more in the discussion.